Miracle at Camp Friendship. Chapter 15. Buddies to the Rescue. We took care of clean-up in no time. Although we cooked like hobos, we ate in a more customary way, with disposable bowls and spoons, except for Racer's Super Sport spoon. There were no leftovers. Every single drop of hobo stew and every crumb of breakfast biscuit were gobbled up. We weren't overstuffed, but we were satisfied. While Mr. Thriftmore and Mr. Friendson took care of the trash, put water on the fire, scattered the coals and loaded their backpacks again, we had one last chance to explore the lovely campsite. Everyone was hoping to find more items from the scavenger list. Racer and Booker had given up hunting for a bird's nest. Instead, they had spotted some birch trees off to the right. Racer was using his Super Sport to hack white bark from a branch that had fallen to the ground. They already had an empty eggshell. Ronnie and I were nearby. We hadn't found either a bird's nest or an empty eggshell, and we needed a piece of white birch bark also. The only things we did have were the red and yellow leaves, a pine cone, and the acorns we had found at the very beginning of the hike. Of course, we did have our needles. Reginald and Hatford were searching the stream bank. They found a white stone and thought they might also find a needle that someone had dropped there. AC and J. Michael said they had collected nearly everything from the list. Their only problem was to decide how they would carry back the fuzzy caterpillar they had found, and who would carry it. The girls were playing at the stream. They wanted to splash their toes in the water. Miss Content reminded them that, although the sun was shining brightly, the mountain water was cold. The girls were persuasive, and finally she agreed to let them see for themselves. They soon found out she was right, and had already put their socks back on. While they did, Susie decided to give their pets one last time in the sun. Although Miriam had accepted the pets, Christy and Sandy were not so sure, and they certainly did not want one to crawl into their shoes. "Please put your lizards back in your pocket," Christy said in a pleading but non-threatening tone. "I know they're your pets, but they make my skin prickly." Well, that was the wrong thing to say to Susie. "My pets won't hurt you," she said, giving Christy a little shove. "You better get used to them, because I'm taking them home with me." It was not a big shove, but it was enough to push Christy off balance, especially since she was sitting right on the edge of the stream bank. She flailed her arms and tried to get her balance by turning the way she was falling. It almost worked. She caught her balance without actually falling into the water and getting completely soaked. However, her stocking feet did end up where she didn't want them, back in the icy water. "Help!" she cried. We all ran in that direction. It sounded like she needed help. It was just the coldness of the water that had caused her startled cry, but she wasn't hurt. When Ronnie caught up with me, all he could say was, "I don't see what the big deal is." There was one problem, small problem though. Remember, before Susie pushed her off balance, Christy had already put her socks back on. Thankfully, her shoes were dry, but her feet, along with her socks, were really wet. She held up her socks and wrung them out to show everyone. "Look what you've done to my buddy," shrieked Sandy with her hands on her hips and her contorted face close to Susie's. Miss Content came running. "Are you all right, Christy?" she asked first. Then, turning to Susie, she said softly, "Why did you push Christy?" "She deserved it. She doesn't like my pets. I guess I showed her." "Oh, Susie," said Miriam sadly, "we are all friends. Now Christy has no dry socks to wear home. Are you sorry for what you did?" "No," said Susie sharply. "If she had left my pets alone, she wouldn't have wet socks." And she turned away in a huff. Poor Susie. She really didn't know anything about heartfelt repentance. She simply justified her actions, thinking that made them okay. Sandy, on the other hand, felt guilty. It was wrong to yell at Susie. As Pastor Gentle would have said, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Calmly, she said honestly and directly to Susie, "Please forgive me. I should not have yelled at you." "Forget it," snarled Susie, and she walked away, guarding her pets, which were now safely tucked away in her jacket pocket. From a distance, the rest of us watched the goings-on with open mouths, but we said nothing. Like everyone who had followed Mr. Frenson's advice, Sandy had on 2 pairs of socks. Even though she might get a blister on the way back to Camp Friendship, she pulled off 1 pair and insisted that Christy wear them. "We're buddies and friends," she said. "I know you would do the same for me." Again, something special was happening. Buddies were helping each other. Then, all too soon, we heard tweet. "Time to head back," called Mr. Frenson. "Everybody ready?" There were a few groans, but Mr. Frenson ignored them. "If we keep moving, we should get back to Camp Friendship in less than 2 hours," he said. It had been an adventure and almost fun to follow the trail down to the campsite, but now we had to climb the path back up the ridge. That was not going to be so easy. As we started out, Mr. Frenson called out, "Hang on to your gear." I saw Ronnie pat his pocket to make sure the compass was there. He smiled a satisfied smile. Then Racer unexpectedly shouted, "Mr. Frenson, I don't have my super sport. I must have left it over by the birch tree. Please wait while I go get it." He started running in that direction, with Mr. Frenson tagging along behind. "How many delays are we going to have?" growled Ronnie under his breath. First the girls, now Racer. He was impatient to get going. The rest of us waited and watched as Mr. Frenson and Racer looked for the supersport. They looked and looked, retracing Racer's steps from the birch tree to the campfire site, and back several times. Mr. Frenson even looked in Racer's backpack and in the stream. There was no supersport. "It has to be here," said Racer desperately. We all went back and helped look. The supersport was nowhere to be found. We even looked through the trash. "Could a raccoon have confiscated it?" asked Reginald. He was always looking for a logical explanation. "I suppose that is possible," said Mr. Frenson, half chuckling, "but it is highly unlikely." There was really no better explanation, though, and the sun was moving farther west all the time. At last Mr. Frenson said, "I'm very sorry, Racer, but we have to go. We'll report it when we get back, and maybe another group will find it later." "How will I explain my carelessness to Dad when I get home?" Racer groaned. "This has ruined the whole retreat for me." It had put a definite blotch on an otherwise pleasant hike, yet there seemed nothing else to do. We had to head back to Camp Friendship. Spirits and tempers were not in great shape as we scratched and scrambled our way up the trail to the ridge. About 15 minutes later, Mr. Frenson called breathlessly from the narrow trail up ahead, "We're almost to the ridge." That was just about when some stones came rolling down the trail toward Ronnie and me and Mr. Thriftmore. What was happening? We couldn't see. "Ah!" J. Michael let out a terrible yell, and more gravel and stones went flying by. "You're okay," I heard Pastor Gentle say. "Here, grab my walking stick." And since we couldn't see, all we could do was listen and speculate as to what was happening. Oh, I think I twisted my ankle," cried J. Michael. Somehow Mr. Frenson and Pastor Gentle managed to get J. Michael to the level ground of the ridge, where Mr. Frenson examined the ankle more closely. He finally determined it wasn't broken, but had been twisted. It hurt, and it was tender to the touch. If you had a crutch to lean on, or even a walking stick like Pastor Gentle's, you wouldn't have put so much weight on your ankle until we get back to camp," said Mr. Frenson. Of course, Pastor Gentle quickly offered, You must use my walking stick, son. Pastor, spoke up Acey, you need that walking stick. J. Michael can lean on me. He's my buddy. I'll help him back to Camp Friendship. He grabbed J. Michael's arm and draped it over his own shoulder. By the time we got back to Camp Friendship, 2 hours later, we must have looked like soldiers returning from battle. Racer and Booker had red scratches on their arms and faces, as well as torn clothes. Pastor Gentle was leaning heavily on his walking cane. J. Michael and Acey were clinging to each other, J. Michael hopping on one foot at times. Sandy and Christy were walking like their feet were sore, and all of us were dirty and very rumpled. Our spirits were at the lowest they'd been in the last 2 days, and we were totally unprepared for what awaited us back at the camp. It seemed that when the spy who had been watching us left us in the woods, he had gone back to Camp Friendship. As we came back up to Camp Friendship, we certainly were not expecting the puzzling scene. On the front porch were Aunt Ruth, Uncle Jake, and a man we'd not seen the whole time we'd been at camp. What was he doing? Why hadn't we seen him before? Was there a problem? What was the connection with Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake? The stranger was tall and slightly stooped, and he looked to be about Mr. Franson's age. He wasn't exactly what you'd call scroungy. In fact, he looked like he had just gotten out of the shower, because his hair was still wet and his face was ruddy as if he had just shaved. His hair was grey and long, though neatly combed back over his ears, like he knew it needed to be cut, but for some reason had not done it. Both Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake evidently knew him. To our utter amazement, they were hugging him, and he was hugging them back. There certainly didn't seem to be a problem. Instead, they all seemed overjoyed. We were confused. Who was this visitor? Why did Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake seem so excited? We had never seen them so animated. We continued to watch in total amazement. Then suddenly Pastor Gentle gasped and put his hand to his chest. I thought he must be having a heart attack because of exhaustion from the hike. Oh my, he cried. Can it be? Mr. Franson's mouth dropped open. I have never seen him look so speechless. His hands dropped to his sides. His face went pale. He let out what sounded like a groan. Then he started towards the porch. David, my old buddy, David? He asked, hopefully, weakly. Pastor Gentle finally recovered, but all he could say was, It's a miracle! Mr. Franson and Pastor Gentle pushed ahead of us. You figured it out too, haven't you? It dawned on the rest of us more slowly. The stranger was David, the prodigal son of Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake. For 14 years he had been living as a hobo, riding the rails, sleeping in boxcars, travelling and working from town to town, seeing the country. There was a lot more to his story, and we soon heard it all.